I love building vintage models. I love helping them meet their model destiny by finally being completed and out of their boxes and then displayed on a shelf and featured in a video for you guys to see it as well. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minute, and today I'm going to be building a vintage Hella Republic F-84G Thunderjet in 1/72 scale. So join me on the workbench today as I get inside this box and see what this kit is like. This kit was actually voted for by you guys, the community, with 35% of over 2,000 people voting, telling me that they wanted me to build this one in a video. To make sure that you get the chance to vote in any future polls, make sure you subscribe so they come up in your feeds here on YouTube. Without any further ado though, let's get stuck into this one. I'll put a list of products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at something similar yourself. I have already done an unboxing video on this particular kit, so if you'd like to take a deeper look inside the box and see what this vintage kit has to offer, I'll link that one underneath the video. Fortunately, this kit did appear to be complete, so I don't have to scratch build anything during this build. As is quite usual for my builds, I'll remove the parts from the sprue using my side cutters and then sand away any flash or rough areas with my sanding stick. Fortunately, this kit doesn't seem to suffer from excess flash. The moulding, despite its age, is quite crisp. There are some cockpit details and I'll start by gluing these together using some Tamiya extra thin cement. A control panel is glued inside one of the fuselage halves, and then the cockpit assembly is glued into place. There is a small part which blanks out the tailpipe of the aircraft, and this was installed here. The air intake on the nose of the aircraft has two internal components which need to be glued together. This also forms the internal area for the nose wheel. And to this I glued the nose wheel landing gear leg. There is an additional support strut that also has to be glued in here. The nose bay doors can be glued into place on the fuselage here, but you could glue the landing gear in a raised position if you wanted to do so. The nose wheel and air intake assembly was then glued into place. And to avoid the aircraft sitting on its tail when it's being completed, I decided I would use some liquid gravity glued as far forwards as possible inside the aircraft. I used some super glue to hold this in place. When this was done, I gave the entire assembly and some smaller parts a grey primer with this Humbrol No. 1 spray can. Next, I thinned down some Humbrol 80 grass green enamel paint with some enamel thinner and then painted this onto the cockpit interior areas. This may not be the most accurate green for this particular cockpit, however I think it's a close enough shade. I've been making a bit of a return to using enamels recently, as I've been enjoying the smooth surface you can get with these, especially if you thin them down. Naturally though, that is due to an increased drying time. Having finished these internal areas, some Humbrol 85 coal black satin was then used. Again, this is another enamel paint which was thinned down with thinners. A Humbrol acrylic No. 62 leather was then used on the headrest of the chair. And when that was dry, I glued together the two fuselage halves. There are some smaller parts which I've already painted as appropriate, and these go at the back of the cockpit. And there is also one at the front which represents the reflector gun sight. Now I can move on to joining the horizontal tail surfaces to the back of the model. And although you can display the air brake in an open position, I decided that I would glue mine in a closed position. The drop tanks come in two parts and these were simply glued together. making sure to glue the pylon onto the top. The wings come in two halves, and these parts were glued together as well, taking care to make sure everything was aligned. One half of the wingtip tank is already moulded onto the wing, so the other half needed to be glued in as well. I then carefully glued the landing gear doors onto the landing gear bays on the wings. As mentioned previously, you could display the landing gear raised simply by gluing the landing gear doors in place to cover those landing gear bays. The landing gear doors in my case though were glued onto the landing gear legs, and then these legs were glued into place to display them in a lowered position. I then carefully glued the underwing drop tanks which I previously assembled into their relevant positions on the lower side of the wing. I also had to make sure that I didn't forget to add the nose air intake cowling. And now I can add these wing assemblies into their slots on the side of the aircraft. I found the cockpit canopy a little fiddly to mask. There are quite a few little window panes, but I used my normal method of sticking down some masking tape and then using the frames as a guide to cut the tape to the right size. This would be done on both the main cockpit canopy and the windscreen. I think you probably could display the canopy in an open position if you wanted to, but I decided that I would glue mine in a closed position. To do this, I glued some Humbrol Clearfix along the various edges and then carefully placed them onto the model. This Clearfix should dry clear and strong, but it is a little bit stringy, so I had to be careful with my placement to make sure I didn't make a mess. And now it's time to give the entire aircraft a black gloss undercoat. I simply used a cheap automotive paint for this. It may not be the best paint in the world, but it does seem to do the job. And now, with that done, I'm going to be using a product that I've not used before. I say that because I have used this in another video, but that video was actually edited before this one, but the build happened after. I'd like to thank my channel members and patrons for the extra support they give my channel, as it's thanks to these guys on screen that I can actually afford new products like this. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our latest member, Michael F. Welcome to the club. If you'd like to know more about what becoming a channel member means, take a look at the links in the description. But anyways, back to the build. So this is a Tamiya lacquer paint. In particular, it's LP11 silver. And as this was my first attempt at using this, I thought I would thin it down with a little bit of SMS lacquer thinner. This thinned down paint was then loaded into the Gallery Ace 98D airbrush. This was a product that Gallery have sent to me free of charge for the purpose of review, but opinions do remain my own. In this case I'm using the 0.5mm needle and around a 12 to 15 psi. I have found this airbrush to be fairly forgiving and potentially something suitable for beginners. In this case though, it wasn't required to do anything too fancy, it just needed to lay down a uniform level of paint onto this particular model. Whilst I did find this paint to be relatively easy to use and give a good silver finish, I wasn't 100% happy with how it looked at the end, and that's something I discussed in my Airfix P51 Mustang build, where I used the same paint, but I used it a lot less heavily. In this one I went for a very uniform finish, and it does look, uniform, but it also looks kind of boring, whereas on the P51 Mustang I used it a lot more sparingly and allowed different areas to have slightly different tonal variation, and I found that a lighter coat was actually a better finish. But that was something, with the power of hindsight, that I learnt as a result of this build. With that lacquer paint now dry, it's time to finish off the rest of the aircraft. The anti-glare panel on the nose of the aircraft was painted with 123 extra dark sea grey. This again is another enamel which has been thinned down. This was painted carefully freehand using the moulded lines which represent these areas on the aircraft. After this I painted the nose intake cowling in number 25 blue. Some panels on the aircraft were required to be painted red, so this was done with number 19 gloss. And this blue and red were also applied to the tail as part of my chosen paint scheme. There is a panel on the tail though which needs to be painted grey, and I used number 1 primer grey for this. The landing gear bays were picked out in the grass green enamel that I used previously for the cockpit. You'll notice that I also picked out the little winglets on the wingtip fuel tanks in the blue colour. This aircraft was then given an overall coat of Humbrol clear gloss varnish, which was simply loaded into the airbrush as it was. It wasn't thinned down in any way. This should give a nice uniform finish in preparation for the transfers. And speaking of the transfers, these decals are the ones that were included in the kit. So they are a little bit old, they do suffer from some slight misalignment and registry issues, but I think I'll be able to use them. Due to the registry issues, I've decided to go for the Norwegian aircraft rather than the French one, as those are not as misaligned. I cut the sheet into more manageable parts, and then soaked the transfers in warm water to release them from the backing paper. Microscale set and sol will be my transfer solutions of choice for this build, and first up the micro set was applied to the aircraft in the areas where the transfers were going to go. Whilst the transfers were still usable, I did notice that they were a little thin, and in places they became a little bit flaky, but I did manage to overcome this problem. It's fortunate that this band on the tail exists, because otherwise this would have been relatively difficult to paint. I did have to make sure I read the instructions as well, because the red band around the fuselage needs to be applied after the lightning bolts on the side of the aircraft. This band was objectively okay, but again this was one that I found to be a little bit flaky after careful manipulation and excessive movement to get in the right place. Generally though, I found these transfers to be acceptable and correctly designed and sized for the various parts that they were fitting onto. With the transfers in place, some micro sol from the red bottle was then brushed over the top to further soften them into the surface details. As this is an older tooling, it does suffer from raised panel lines, and I just wanted to make sure that these decals would actually conform to these surfaces. With that done, I decided to blend in the decals by applying a little bit more of the Humbrol clear gloss over them, just to help seal them in and give them the same kind of finish that the rest of the aircraft has. However, for the anti-glare grey over the top of the aircraft, I used some SMS Premium Flat Clear varnish and carefully airbrushed just these areas to dull them down a bit. Turning my attention to the wheels, these have already been airbrushed with the silver lacquer paint from before, but the tyres were painted in Vallejo matte black. These wheels could then be carefully glued onto their axles on the landing gear, making sure of course not to forget the nose wheel. A small clear part is provided for a landing light, which needs to be glued to the inside of one of the landing gear doors. There are also some small clear parts as well, which need to go at the front of the wingtip tanks. Again, these were glued in using some Humbrol Clear Fix. With that done, I carefully removed the masking tape on the cockpit canopy, and I'm calling my build of this vintage Hella F-84 complete. And there we have it, another model out of the stash, out of its vintage box, and helped to meet its destiny of being completed. I've been looking through my little journal. I keep notes of all of my builds in here so far, and if you want to get your hands on a book like this, you could do so as I've written them, and they're on Amazon if you'd like to support the channel. And in here it tells me, because I've been making my notes, that this took me 3 days to complete, so I probably would have done that a bit more on and off. I believe the particular version I have here in this box is a 1993 release, so this actually predates me starting modelling. And I'm pretty sure that when I bought it off of eBay as part of a job lot for, about £5 per model. And I'm actually quite impressed with how well it's held up. The box has suffered in a few places, it's got some tears and rips and things, but everything that I needed was included in the kit, and it all seems to have gone relatively straightforward. Yes, this model does suffer from the fact that it is a 1978 tooling, and as a result doesn't necessarily feature the sort of quality and details that we would expect from a model today, such as recessed panel lines. That being said though, the fit of the parts was really good, and I didn't find I had to use any filler, as there weren't any particularly noticeable gaps. I could have gone a little bit further to add extra weathering, perhaps a wash may have caught in those panel lines, but I quite like the look of this Norwegian aircraft in its almost pristine finish. As mentioned previously though, whilst I think the Tamiya lacquer paint is quite good, giving a fairly uniform overall silver finish, I think that had I gone a little bit lighter and added more variation like I did with my P51 kit, it would have given a slightly better result. I think that having put too much paint on, it looks a little bit dull in its finish. Having hand painted everything else though, I'm pretty happy with how neat the rest of the paintwork looks. I think this particular kit blends together the various skills that I've been working on over my modelling career, such as hand painting and now getting into airbrushing as well. It's a shame that those French decals suffered from the registration issues, because that would have also been an interesting paint scheme to complete, but naturally as you get 2 decal schemes but only 1 model in the kit, it did come down to a choice of which one I was going to do. If I did have one small gripe about this kit, it's the fact that it lacks having a display stand included and a pilot. It would have been nice to have seen this one in a flying pose. On the whole though, I'm pretty happy with how this one looks, and I've managed to use it as a little bit of a testbed for new products. I know I've already discussed the fact that this is a 1978 tooling and a 1993 release for me. It is actually possible to get this one in a much more recent box. To the best of my knowledge, this was also available back in 2014, so about 10 years ago. If Hella was still manufacturing this kit today, it wouldn't necessarily be up to the same standard as model kits that we kind of expect. But if it was cheap enough, it wouldn't be a particularly bad model to complete. I could be tempted to get another one at some point, as it didn't really present too much of a challenge. But let me know down in the comments what you think of my build and whether my assessment of this vintage kit was fair. Once again, thanks to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Alternatively, there are other ways to help support the channel if you'd like to do so, and again, full information is underneath the video. The best way to support the channel though, for free, is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Last thing to say though is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. To make sure you have the chance to make sure you vote in the votes for this to make sures. Alright, okay, I'm going to do that bit again. I used some Vallejo. Did I use Vallejo or did I use satin black? What did I use here? With that lacquer. Oh, that's a coat of something. As mentioned though, the best. No,